Hello and welcome to my Circuit Playground Express photographic light meter presentation. My name is Alex Infante and I'm in my senior semester of the BAS Computing Technology and Software Development at Valencia College. For this project, I created a light meter that calculates photographic exposures using an Adafruit Circuit Playground Express and a TSL 2591 high dynamic range digital light sensor. So what is a light meter? Light meters in photography help the photographer calculate proper exposure given the lighting conditions. Light meters are calibrated to give a reading that matches the 18% middle gray. And middle gray is the tone that is about halfway between pure black and pure white. Its purpose is to help the photographer make an informed decision about their photographic exposures given the lighting in the image. It helps the photographer figure out how they want the lighting in the final scene to look. Photographic settings. So there are three things a photographer can use to help alter their image. ISO, which is the sensitivity of the sensor or the film. As ISO increases, sensitivity to the film or the sensor increases, meaning less light is needed to properly expose an image. Aperture, measured in f-stops. This is the size of the opening of the lens, which controls how much light is being let in. So, as aperture decreases, the size of the opening increases, meaning less light is needed to expose an image. And shutter speed, measured in fractions of a second or full seconds. This is how long the sensor or film is exposed to light. So as the shutter speed increases, the sensor is exposed to more light. So those are how these settings affect the lighting in the image, and on the chart here shows how they affect motion and depth of field, gain or noise in an image. So a half-second exposure time will create a blurry image. A 1/1000th shutter speed will freeze any fast motion. A wide depth of field or a wide open aperture makes the depth of field very shallow. A larger depth of field means more things will be in focus. As the ISO decreases, the sensor is less sensitive to light, meaning more light is needed, creating less noise or grain in the image. And as the ISO gets higher, it is more sensitive to light, so less light is needed, making the noise and the grain way more pronounced. So for this project I used the Circuit Playground Express, which is a microcontroller with plenty of features, and one of them being able to detect light. So the native light sensor only returns a light value. For photographic exposures, a unit like an EV or lux is needed, so that's where the TSL 2591 add-on really helps. It is a luminosity sensor, so it can read in lux. Lux can be converted to EV, which is exposure value, and then the EV can be used to calculate proper exposure. Calculating exposure. Exposure calculations are logged into a spreadsheet and printed to the console. So the aperture and ISO are provided by the user in the program, and the shutter speed is calculated by the code. So as the EV increases, the shutter speed decreases because the sensor requires less light to reach that middle gray setting. So for the program here, the user can select the ISO that they're using and then the aperture that they're using as well. As the Circuit Playground collects the light, it calculates the lux value and the EV, and using the EV, it can calculate the shutter speed. So for this project, the Circuit Playground Express can be used with many different IDEs and languages, but for my purposes I used CircuitPython. The IDE I chose for this project is called MooEditor. To collect the data, I used Microsoft Excel. In the program, it writes the data to the console and enters it into the sheet. The Circuit Playground has the benefit of being an I/O device, meaning it can be used to emulate physical hardware, so it emulates itself as a keyboard and mouse and logs the data into the Excel sheet as if I'm typing it myself. So this was a workaround for Circuit Playground's limited onboard memory, because writing and creating a file was found to be kind of difficult and hard to work around. So here we have the CircuitPython on the left in the MooEditor. So the first step is to calculate the EV, because that is needed for all the other calculations. So the sensor collects a lux value, and we have a equation to turn it into EV. EV changes as ISO changes, so as the sensitivity increases or decreases, a different EV value is needed. So the EV value is initially based off of an ISO of 100, and depending on what the user selects, the EV has to be recalculated. And then here we have the shutter speed calculation based on the aperture and ISO that the user picks. And then after that it writes and prints to the console. So it writes it over to the Excel sheet, giving the lux, the shutter speed, and the time. So every 30 minutes we had a reading, and depending on the lighting conditions, the shutter speed would change as well. The initial challenge was to get the device to read light in a way that exposure calculations could be made. I soon realized that the Circuit Playground's light sensor does not provide useful units, so I had to purchase the TSL 2591 so it can read in lux, and then the lux can be converted to EV. This is a photo of the setup with the Circuit Playground and the light sensor connected to it. So after getting everything set up, we have the code, which was explained earlier. After gathering all the right tools, I was able to create the calculations. The first version of this project only took a reading when I pressed the button on the Circuit Playground. This was great for testing, but a loop would need to be created to gather more data. Findings and results. Shutter speed and lux are inversely correlated. This is because a high lux value means that the scene is bright, lowering the amount of time the shutter would need to be open. So when a scene is dark, the shutter needs to be open for much longer, sometimes minutes at a time. So this is about 2 weeks of data collection, and as we can see, the discrepancies between the lux and the shutter speed are pretty big, because the lux can be in the thousands while the shutter speed normally never goes higher than a couple minutes. So we can see the peaks of the lux values would be just as the day goes on, the brightest part of the day, and then it goes down, and then you could see the peaks of the shutter speeds, which is, we have a separate chart to see it a little bit better. The shutter speeds peaked during the night. So the first half of the readings were done without a yellow filter on, and it's kind of the same deal. So this pretty much follows how the day goes, and then at night the lux goes down, and then as the sun rises it goes back down, and then the inverse relation with the shutter speeds. This is a graph of just the shutter speed values. So as we can see, during the darkest parts of the night, the shutter speeds are quite high. These are in seconds. Based on the user settings, this is how long the shutter would need to be open to get proper exposure to reach that middle gray. So some of them, during almost complete darkness are 90 seconds, almost 90 seconds, and then we can see in the bottom here, during the brightest parts of the day, the shutter speed is only around a 60th or a 30th of a second, so it barely shows up in the graph here. In the readings with the yellow filter reduces the amount of light that the sensor is exposed to, but the data follows the same course. Bright peaks of lux during the day, very low at night, and then the shutter speed, if we were to zoom in, would peak during the night. So the same thing with the shutter speeds. This is like a zoomed in version of this. During the night, the darkest parts of the night, the shutter speeds would peak. During the day, it would be very low, not even 1 second. So my results. So it was found that the average lux reading was 112, and with the yellow filter is 127. So technically, with all conditions the same, the yellow filter should have a lower average, but weather and lighting can change depending on if clouds come by or anything like that. So if it was a cloudy week during the hurricane, the lux values were typically lower. And the conclusion of the lux values always peaked during the day, and the shutters always peaked at night. So the biggest challenge was finding a way for the Circuit Playground to collect data. Not having any onboard power means it needs to be plugged in 24/7. So I was lucky enough to find an old desktop that I could set up by the window and have the Circuit Playground collect data just plugged in on the whole time. And another issue was setting the gain of the TSL. So during the day, the sensor would get overwhelmed and stop collecting data, so I had to lower the gain amount. The problem is it takes only one bright day for it to get overwhelmed, and you have to restart the data collection. Learning how photographic exposure is calculated was quite difficult, and getting it to match the light meter that I already have was also a challenge. The most gratifying experience was getting the Circuit Playground to match the readings I got from my Sekonic light meter. This told me that I was on track and I'm making the correct calculations. Successfully taking those readings and converting them to photographic settings was quite fulfilling because I got to learn a lot more about how photographic exposure is calculated. So the initial disappointment was realizing I had to buy another module to make the project work in the way that I initially envisioned. So, and also losing power during the hurricane disrupted a good amount of my data collection, so I had to restart it, but I was able to recover my Excel sheet. So if I were to do the project again, I would make sure I had a way to mobilize the setup and all the equipment needed in the beginning so I could start without any disruptions. And if I had more time or resources, I would probably try to make the light meter completely mobile using an external battery source and another microcontroller like an Arduino to run the code and a screen to output the data. So then the device could actually be used during photography. And that was my presentation on the Circuit Playground Express light meter, and thank you for listening.